They told me the patient in room 412 had died hours ago, but when I pulled back the sheet, his chest began to rise and fall in a rhythmic, terrifying motion. I didn't know it then, but uncovering that secret would drag me into an organized scheme far darker than anything a hospital should ever hide. The fluorescent lights in the oncology ward hummed with a sound that felt like a drill against my skull. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the hospital shifts from a place of healing to a graveyard of quiet desperation. My name is Elena, and for 7 years, I was the head orderly on the 4th floor of St. Jude's. I knew every creak of the floorboards, every rhythmic gasp of the ventilators, and every secret tucked away in the charts of patients the doctors had long ago stopped checking on. I was finishing my rounds when I reached room 412. This was the room of Mr. Henderson, an elderly man whose life had been slowly flickering out for weeks. He was a do not resuscitate case, a man who had asked for nothing but peace in his final hours. According to the shift logs left by the evening nurse, he had passed away at 11:45 p.m. The doctor had already signed the paperwork. The family had been notified, and they were already on their way to make final arrangements. I stepped into the room to perform the standard post-mortem procedures. The lights were dimmed, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the city outside. I walked toward the bed, my rubber soles squeaking against the polished linoleum. I reached for the sheet to cover his face, ready to begin the solemn process of cleaning up, when I saw it. His chest moved. It wasn't a muscle spasm. It was a slow, deliberate intake of air. My heart hammered against my ribs. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I moved closer, pressing my fingers to his wrist. A pulse, weak, thready, but definitely there. He was warm. He was alive. Panic, cold and sharp, washed over me. I checked his chart again. Everything was signed. Everything was official. I knew the protocol. I had to report this to the head of the department immediately. I stepped out of the room, my hands trembling, and practically ran toward the nurse's station where Dr. Aris was reviewing files. He was a man of cold precision, a surgeon whose reputation was as spotless as his white coat. "Doctor," I gasped, breathless. "Mr. Henderson, in 412, he's still breathing. He has a pulse." Dr. Aris didn't even look up. He adjusted his glasses, the blue light of his tablet reflecting in his eyes. "Elena, you've had a long shift. You're seeing things that aren't there. Mr. Henderson was pronounced dead 4 hours ago. Go get a cup of coffee and finish your reports." "Doctor, I'm telling you, I checked. He is alive. We need to call for a rapid response team right now." I reached for the emergency call button on the desk, but his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with a grip that was far stronger than I expected. "Listen to me carefully," he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That patient is dead. He was declared dead by the book. If you go back in there and report otherwise, you are not just questioning my clinical judgment. You are accusing this entire facility of negligence. Do you have any idea what that does to our funding, to our standing? You will keep your mouth shut. You will file the papers as instructed, and you will forget you ever stepped into that room." I stared at him, bewildered. His eyes were devoid of any empathy, filled instead with a calculated, chilling resolve. I pulled my arm away. "I'm not lying, and I won't be a part of this. I'm going to the night supervisor." I turned on my heel, ignoring his sharp command to stop. I rushed to the administrative office, my mind racing. How could a doctor, a man who took an oath, Just decide a patient was dead to satisfy a schedule or a budget. As I reached the elevator, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was the security guard, Miller. He looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "Elena, don't do this," he whispered. "You don't know what you're dealing with. There's an organized scheme running in this wing. You report that, and you're not just looking at a job loss. You're looking at an attempt to break your life with a heavy legal charge. They'll paint you as unstable. They'll say you were smuggling prohibited substances, or that you were involved with some radical group. They have the resources to bury you under a mountain of falsified evidence." I stopped, my hand hovering over the elevator button. The air in the hallway suddenly felt thin. I looked at Miller, realizing he wasn't just a guard. He was a cog in their machine, warning me because he was scared of what would happen if I rattled the cage too hard. "What do you mean, scheme?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Just go home, Elena," he said, pushing me gently toward the exit. "Clock out. Forget the room. Forget the man." I left the hospital that night, trembling. When I arrived for my shift the next evening, my access card wouldn't work. The main desk told me to see the HR director. When I walked into the office, I found 2 men in suits I didn't recognize, and Dr. Aris sitting in the corner, staring at me with a satisfied smirk. "Elena," the HR director said, not even looking up, "you've been terminated for gross negligence and unauthorized access to restricted hospital files, effective immediately. And while you're clearing out your locker, there's something you should know. The police have been notified about some irregularities found in your personal locker during an internal security check." I felt the blood drain from my face. "I don't have anything in my locker." "We found prohibited substances, Elena," the HR director continued, his voice monotone, "and evidence linking you to a group that has been under investigation by the Internal Security Department for months. We have your fingerprints on the bags. You are facing an accusation of a very serious nature. You should probably call a lawyer." My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. I pulled it out, and the screen illuminated a single photo. A shot of me walking out of room 412 the night before, followed by the text. "The man you think you saved is already gone, and if you speak, you're next." I looked up, and the 2 men in suits stood up, blocking the door. I realized then that this wasn't just a firing. This was a setup, and I had just walked straight into the lion's den. I clutched my bag, my heart hammering like a trapped bird, and as the lead man reached for his handcuffs, I heard a sound from behind the closed blinds of the office window. A heavy, mechanical click, like the sound of a piece of illegal weaponry being readied for use. The click echoed in the small office, vibrating through the glass panes as if the building itself were exhaling in anticipation. My lungs felt like they had turned to stone. I didn't just hear the sound, I felt the intent behind it. These men weren't here to handle an HR dispute. They were here to make sure a witness disappeared before she could articulate what she'd seen in room 412. "Sit down, Elena," the man on the left said. He had a jagged scar tracing the line of his jaw, and his eyes were as empty as the hospital corridor after midnight. He didn't wait for me to comply. He grabbed my arm and shoved me into the guest chair. My bag slid across the floor, spilling my pens and notebook. "You've been a very curious employee," Dr. Aris said, finally standing up. He circled me like a shark smelling blood in the water. "We pride ourselves on the efficiency of this facility. When a patient is terminal, our organized scheme ensures they transition in a way that minimizes cost and maximizes the benefit to our research partners. You, however, decided that your conscience was more important than the system. And that, my dear, is an expensive mistake. I looked at the HR director, hoping for a flicker of humanity. But he was busy typing on his laptop, his face a mask of bureaucratic apathy. He was just another cog, likely being paid to ensure the paperwork for my demise was bulletproof. "You're killing them," I whispered, my voice trembling but finding a shred of defiance. "You're not letting them pass. You're facilitating their exit before they've even had a chance to fight." "I am a man of science, Elena," Eris replied, stopping inches from my face. "And science requires resources. Sometimes the most efficient resource is a patient who no longer has a future. But you have a future, just not the one you expected. You are now the primary suspect in an investigation regarding the distribution of prohibited substances within this hospital. With the weight of the evidence we've discovered, you're looking at an incredibly long sentence, decades behind bars. Unless, of course, you choose to cooperate." The man with the scar stepped forward, his hand resting inside his jacket. I knew exactly what he was carrying, even if I couldn't see the weapon. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the threat of violence. "What kind of cooperation?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "We have a situation in the basement level, a containment unit that needs to be cleared," Eris said, his voice smooth and cold. "If you go down there and perform one last task, we might be able to lose the evidence in your locker. The choice is yours. Be a martyr for a dead man in 412, or walk out of here tonight with your record clean." I knew it was a trap. Every instinct told me that the moment I agreed to go to the basement, I wouldn't be walking out. They needed a scapegoat for whatever horror was hidden in the bowels of St. Jude's. But as I glanced at the two men standing by the door, I saw the exit, a narrow gap between the heavy oak door and the frame. "I need a moment to think," I lied, keeping my head down, appearing defeated. "You have 10 seconds, the scar-faced man growled. I counted. 1, 2, 3. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about the organized scheme or the decades of prison time I was supposedly facing. I grabbed the heavy glass carafe of water sitting on the desk and swung it with everything I had at the lamp next to the HR director. The glass shattered, the bulb exploded in a shower of sparks, and the room was plunged into darkness. The men shouted, stumbling over chairs. I didn't wait for them to recover. I lunged for the door, my shoulder slamming into the scar-faced man's chest. He grunted, his hand reaching for the weapon hidden in his coat, but he was blinded by the sudden shift from light to dark. I bolted into the hallway, my heart racing so fast it felt like it would tear through my skin. "Stop her!" Eris's voice shrieked from the office. I sprinted toward the stairwell, my breath hitching in my chest. I knew the layout of this hospital better than anyone. I bypassed the elevators, knowing they'd lock them down from the security station the second they reached a console. I threw myself into the stairwell and began descending, leaping down 3 steps at a time. I heard the heavy boots of the men pursuing me. They were fast, but they didn't know the service shortcuts. I reached the 3rd floor, ignored the exit signs, and darted into the laundry chute access point, a tight, cramped space that led directly behind the main maintenance corridor. I crawled through the dusty, narrow passage, the smell of industrial bleach and stagnant air filling my lungs. I emerged in the basement, a place I had only ever visited once before to clear a blocked drainage pipe. It was a labyrinth of pipes, boilers, and shadowed alcoves. I hid behind a massive furnace, listening. Their voices were getting closer, echoing off the concrete walls. "She can't have gotten far," the scar-faced man said. "The building is locked down. Check the perimeter." I held my breath, pressing my hand over my mouth. I had to get out. I had to reach the front entrance, or at least a phone. But as I peeked around the edge of the furnace, I saw something that froze my blood. In the center of the basement, shielded by heavy curtains, was a makeshift laboratory. And there, strapped to a gurney in the middle of the room, was Mr. Henderson. He was still alive, his eyes wide with terror, hooked up to a series of glowing canisters filled with a neon blue liquid. He wasn't the only one. There were dozens of gurneys, each occupied by a patient who had been pronounced deceased by the hospital. They were being used as living batteries, their bodies acting as conduits for some kind of experimental energy process. My hand slipped, knocking over a loose metal wrench. It hit the floor with a deafening clang. Silence filled the room. The hum of the machinery suddenly cut out, leaving a ringing in my ears. A beam of a flashlight sliced through the darkness, landing directly on my face. "Found her," a voice whispered from the shadows right behind me. I spun around, but it was too late. A sharp pain bloomed in my neck, and the world began to tilt and dissolve into static. As I collapsed to the concrete floor, the last thing I saw was the man with the scar standing over me, pointing a suppressed firearm at my forehead, while behind him, Mr. Henderson's heart monitor, which had been silent for hours, began to beep in a rhythmic, terrifying pattern. Beep, beep, beep. The darkness didn't take me immediately. It pulled at me like a heavy velvet shroud, dragging my consciousness down into a pit of black, oily water. My vision fractured, the beam of the flashlight dancing in chaotic arcs against the cold, damp ceiling. The pain in my neck, where a tranquilizer dart had lodged, pulsed like a second rhythmic heartbeat. I tried to scream, but my tongue felt like a lead weight, thick and useless in my mouth. "Check her pockets," a voice commanded. It was distant, distorted by the buzzing in my ears. "She's a tenacious little thing, isn't she? Always looking into places where she doesn't belong." I felt rough hands patting me down. They seized my cell phone, my keys, and the small silver locket I'd worn since childhood. Then they hauled me up by my arms, my heels dragging across the concrete. The movement sent fresh waves of nausea through my system. I was tossed onto a metal gurney, the cold surface biting into my skin, and the sharp bite of synthetic restraints snapped shut around my wrists and ankles. As the fog in my brain began to lift, I forced my eyes to focus. I was in the laboratory, not the main wing, but this hidden chamber, this blasphemous altar to their greed. The blue liquid I had seen earlier was moving through translucent tubes, pulsating with a sickly, rhythmic light. It wasn't just energy. It looked like living plasma, glowing with a bioluminescence that made my skin crawl. Dr. Aris stepped into my line of sight. He looked even more clinical here, stripped of his white coat, wearing a rubber apron stained with streaks of the same neon blue substance. He leaned over me, his face hovering just inches from mine. "You have a knack for discovery, Elena," he said, his voice devoid of any pretense of professionalism. "Most people would have kept their eyes shut. But you had to peek behind the curtain. You've seen the foundation of our organized scheme. Do you know what this is?" I couldn't speak, but my eyes locked onto his, burning with a hatred that finally pierced through the drug-induced haze. It's an optimization of the end-of-life cycle, he continued, as if lecturing a student. Why waste a perfectly functional biomechanical system when the heart stops? We found a way to bridge the gap between cessation and total shutdown. We turn the brain into a processor. We utilize the remaining electrochemical energy to drive high-density data mining for our research partners. It's profitable, it's efficient, and it's entirely undetectable by traditional diagnostic tools. And you, my dear, have just volunteered to be our next primary unit. My heart lurched. I tugged at the restraints, the metal links biting into my skin until I felt warm blood trickle down my wrists. He wasn't just talking about murder. He was talking about an eternal conscious state of agony, a living hell trapped in a body that was no longer mine. You're monsters, I managed to rasp, the words barely escaping my throat. Eris chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. We are pioneers, and pioneers always require sacrifices. The legal charges we prepared for you, the prohibited substances, the radical ties, those were just to ensure that when you finally pass away here, no one will come looking for you. You'll be the disgraced orderly who ran off to live a life of crime, only to meet a tragic end. He walked over to a bank of monitors. The screens were filled with scrolling data, cascading rows of green and blue light. Among the charts, I saw a folder labeled Project Lazarus. My eyes widened. It wasn't just about research. It was a trade, a black market exchange of human biological data. Suddenly, a red light began to flash on the far wall. A siren, low and mournful, started to wail. Eris froze, his gaze snapping to the monitors. What is that? We're not scheduled for a cycle restart. The room began to tremble. A deep, mechanical groan vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of something massive struggling to break free. Mr. Henderson, who had been lying perfectly still on the adjacent gurney, suddenly arched his back. His eyes snapped open. They weren't brown anymore. They were solid, glowing spheres of that same neon blue light. He let out a sound that wasn't human, a distorted, digitized scream that shattered the silence of the basement. "The integrity is failing!" one of the technicians yelled, stumbling back from the consoles. "The energy load is too high! He's overriding the inhibitors!" Eris lunged toward the main terminal, but he was too late. A surge of electricity exploded from the pipes overhead, showering the room in white-hot sparks. The gurneys shook violently, the restraints straining against the sudden, unnatural force. I looked over at Mr. Henderson. He was staring directly at me. His face, once etched with the exhaustion of his terminal illness, was now set in a mask of terrible, focused intensity. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like an avatar for something else, something that had been waiting in the dark for a long, long time. He pulled his arm, the one that had been restrained, and with a sickening tear of metal and flesh, he ripped the cuff right out of the gurney's frame. He wasn't supposed to have that kind of strength. No human, dead or alive, could do that. "Shut it down! Kill the power!" Eris screamed, his voice cracking with genuine panic. The room erupted into chaos. Technicians scrambled for the emergency shutoff, but the controls had fused together in the surge. I felt the restraint on my right wrist loosen as the metal gurney warped under the massive electrical discharge. Mr. Henderson rolled off his gurney, his movements jerky and inhuman, and began to advance toward Eris. He didn't walk. He glided, the blue light from his eyes illuminating the room like headlights in the fog. "Stay back!" Eris yelled, drawing his own weapon, a sleek, compact piece of illegal hardware. He fired. The shot rang out, a sharp crack in the confined space, but the bullet seemed to dissolve before it could even make contact, absorbed by the shimmering field of blue energy radiating from Mr. Henderson's skin. I kicked against the metal restraints, my adrenaline spiking, fueled by the sheer terror of what was happening. My right hand came free, the skin torn and bleeding, but I didn't care. I reached for the latch on my left side, my fingers fumbling, slipping on the slick, cold steel. "Help me!" I screamed, not at the men, but at the only other person in the room. Mr. Henderson turned his head slowly toward me. For a split second, the blue light in his eyes flickered, and I saw a flash of the man he used to be, the kind old soul who liked to talk about his garden. Then, the blue light surged back, brighter and more violent than before. He ignored Eris and reached out a hand toward me. His skin was glowing, his fingers trembling with a power that seemed to vibrate the very air. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was reaching for the central power cable that ran underneath my gurney, the very cable that was feeding my restraints and keeping the life-draining process running. "No!" Eris shrieked, aiming his weapon at Henderson's head. But before Eris could fire again, a massive, deafening boom echoed through the basement. The wall of the containment unit blew inward, not from an explosion, but from an external force of such magnitude that the entire foundation groaned. Dust and debris filled the air, choking me. As the smoke cleared, I saw a silhouette standing in the breach of the wall. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the Internal Security Service. It was a team of figures in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind matte black visors, their weapons leveled not at the criminals, but at everyone in the room. And at their head, standing in the doorway, was a woman in a sharp gray suit. The very same woman who had been seen visiting the hospital's board of directors just 2 days prior. She looked at me, then at the pulsating blue mess that was the experiment, and finally at the terrified Dr. Eris. "Clean up," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "Leave no biological traces behind, and ensure the orderly is neutralized before she can process what she's seen." The tactical team began to move, their weapons raised. I realized then that there was no way out. The organized scheme wasn't a rogue operation by a corrupt doctor. It was a corporate asset, and they were here to burn the evidence, starting with me. As the lead operative lowered his weapon and took aim at my chest, Mr. Henderson lunged for the central power core. With a scream of twisting metal, he tore the main cable from the floor, and the entire room plunged into total, blinding, absolute darkness, accompanied by a sound like the world itself being ripped apart. The silence that followed the electrical discharge was heavier than the explosion itself. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, a vacuum where the world had been sucked dry of sound. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No movement, no breathing, not even the hum of the ventilation. Then, the darkness was shattered by the harsh, rhythmic flicker of emergency lighting as the backup generators kicked in, casting long, sickly shadows across the basement floor. I was lying on the floor, having tumbled from the gurney the moment the power cut. My hands were scraped, my breath came in ragged, jagged hitches, and my vision was swimming. I forced myself to look up. The tactical team had frozen, their weapons aimed toward the center of the room. Mr. Henderson was standing over the mangled remains of the power conduit. His form was flickering, literally flickering, as if his physical presence was struggling to remain anchored in this reality. He wasn't the man I had known, but he wasn't a weapon either. He was a glitch, a mistake that had become a nightmare. The woman in the gray suit hadn't flinched. She stood by the shattered wall, watching the chaos with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an ant farm. She tapped a device on her wrist, and the tactical team began to advance, their boots thudding in unison against the concrete. "Terminate the containment breach," she ordered, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears like a razor. "And secure the witness. If she survives the cleanup, she is to be taken to the processing facility. I want to know exactly how much data she absorbed before the link was severed." My blood turned to ice. Processing facility. I knew what that meant. It wasn't a prison, it was a factory for what they were doing here. I scrambled backward, my fingers catching on a discarded metal pipe. I didn't know how to fight, but I knew the basement. I knew the service tunnels. As the first of the tactical team fired a suppressed shot, the thwip-thwip of high-velocity rounds hitting the metal wall beside my head, I swung the pipe at the junction box near my foot. Sparks showered the area as the emergency lighting circuits fused, plunging us into total, suffocating blackness once more. "Target has visual! Engage!" one of the operatives shouted. I didn't wait. I crawled, sliding through the oily grime of the floor, moving toward the narrow vent behind the industrial boiler that I had used to enter this level. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't just leave Mr. Henderson. I looked back through the gloom. The blue light from his chest was dimming, his form becoming translucent. He was fading away, but he was blocking the path of the team. He was drawing their fire, his body acting as a lightning rod for the rounds that whistled through the dark. I reached the vent, my fingers tearing at the grate. It was rusted, stuck, resisting my desperate tugs. "Come on, damn it, move!" Behind me, I heard a wet, metallic sound, the sound of someone being struck. Then, a low, guttural roar that wasn't human. Mr. Henderson was fighting back. He lunged into the darkness, a blur of motion, and I heard the sound of men struggling, grunts of pain, the clatter of gear hitting the floor, the frantic shouts of the tactical squad. I gave one final, primal yank, and the grate clattered to the ground. I squeezed through the opening just as a flashlight beam sliced through the space where I had been standing. I didn't look back. I crawled into the narrow, claustrophobic darkness of the vent, the smell of damp earth and rot filling my nose. I scrambled until my lungs burned, moving blindly through the labyrinthine ducts of the hospital. I could hear them behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of boots, the muffled commands over radios. They were closing in. They knew the floor plan better than I did, and they were hunting me like an animal. I reached a junction in the vents, the one that led to the upper levels. I had a choice: go up to the main floors, where the staff and the patients were, or go down further into the sub-basement where the building's main records were stored. If I could get to the files, if I could prove what they were doing. No, they'd never let me leave. I took the upward path, aiming for the morgue. It was a place nobody went to at this hour. If I could hide there, maybe I could find a way to contact the outside world, a way to get the evidence out. I kicked out the exit grate, tumbling out into the cold, clinical air of the morgue. It was quiet. Too quiet. The rows of cold storage units were lined up like silent sentinels. I hurried to the back office, my heart hammering against my ribs, and grabbed the logbook from the desk. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely read the names. Then I stopped. The logbook wasn't filled with names of patients who had passed away. It was filled with lists of names, dates, and amounts. Money transfers from offshore accounts. Millions of dollars paid out for logistical support and biological acquisition. And at the bottom of the page, in bold red ink, was a date. Today's date. And a single entry. Subject: Elena Vance. Status: awaiting integration. My own name. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck. I looked up and saw my own reflection in the darkened glass of the office window. Behind me, in the reflection, stood a figure. It wasn't one of the tactical team. It was the woman in the gray suit. She was standing just inside the morgue entrance, her hands clasped in front of her, watching me with a look of predatory patience. "You're a very difficult woman to lose, Elena," she said, her voice echoing in the cold, cavernous room. "But you've made a fatal error. You assumed that if you reached the morgue, you'd be safe. You forgot that in this hospital, the morgue is the one place where we have total, absolute control." She stepped forward, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the morgue doors behind her had been locked. I was trapped. "Do you know why we chose you, Elena?" she asked, walking toward me. "It wasn't just because you happened to be in the wrong room. It's because you were the only one who didn't look away. You have a rare, natural capacity for high-level data absorption. We've been waiting for a candidate with your particular neural chemistry for years." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small silver syringe. The liquid inside wasn't blue. It was a deep, iridescent violet. "The tactical team is outside," she said, motioning to the door. "We can do this quickly, or we can do this in the processing unit where the agony will last for weeks. Either way, you are going to become the most valuable asset this hospital has ever owned." I backed away until I hit the row of cold storage units. I was cornered. There was no way out, and the air in the room seemed to be growing thinner, colder. I looked at the syringe, then at her eyes. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for the moment I realized that hope was just a lie they told the dying. I took a deep breath, and I did the only thing I could think of. I reached behind me, grabbed the latch of the nearest cold storage unit, and yanked it open. Not to hide in it, but to trigger the emergency alarm hidden inside. A manual release that would vent the liquid nitrogen and seal the entire morgue from the inside out. As the pressurized gas hissed into the room, creating a blinding, frozen fog, I saw the woman's face twist in genuine, panicked surprise for the first time. But as the temperature plummeted, I felt something else, a sudden, sharp sting in my own shoulder. I looked down. A second, smaller dart had been embedded in my skin, fired from somewhere behind the rows of units. As the world began to blur and the cold numbed my senses, I saw a figure emerge from the fog. A tall, gaunt man in a lab coat, his face obscured by a surgical mask. He wasn't one of the tactical team. He was someone I recognized. "Don't worry," the man whispered, his voice a ghost from my past. A doctor I had worked with years ago, a man who had died in a car crash 3 years ago. "They aren't going to turn you into a battery. I have a much different use for you." And then the world went black. I woke up to the smell of ozone and wet rust. My limbs felt heavy, like they were encased in lead, and every breath was a labored negotiation with a chest that felt like it had been crushed by a hydraulic press. I wasn't in the morgue anymore. I wasn't even in the hospital. I was strapped to a hard, unforgiving surface, a chair, judging by the way my spine was angled against the metal. I couldn't move my arms. Thick, braided cables were fused to my wrists, leading up into the ceiling where they hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth. The room was illuminated by a single flickering strobe light, casting everything in disjointed, nightmarish frames. "Awake, finally," a voice said from the shadows. It was him, Dr. Sterling, the man who had been my mentor, the man whose funeral I had attended, the man who had supposedly perished in that car wreck years ago. He stepped into the strobe's path. He looked older, his face a map of jagged, stress-induced wrinkles, but his eyes were bright, too bright, with a manic, scholarly fever. He wasn't wearing a lab coat anymore. He wore a utility suit, heavily patched with industrial tape, and around his neck hung a device that looked like a crude, handheld fusion core. "Sterling?" I rasped, my throat feeling like it had been scraped with sandpaper. "You're supposed to be dead." "I am dead, Elena," he said, tapping his chest. "I died the moment I found out what the hospital was really doing with the Project Lazarus protocols. The board didn't just want data, they wanted a weapon. They wanted to harness the last, dying impulses of the human brain to create a sentient, adaptive virus. They didn't just kill me, they turned me into a ghost, hiding in the crawl spaces of my own creation." He leaned closer, and I could see the blue, bioluminescent veins pulsing under the skin of his throat. He was a product of the very system I had been running from. They didn't save me to keep me alive. They saved me to keep me working. I had to become part of the machine to survive it. And now, you're here to take my place. "No," I hissed, struggling against the restraints. The movement triggered a spike of pure, raw electricity through the cables on my wrists. I screamed, the sound tearing through the room. "It's not a choice, Elena," Sterling whispered, his hand hovering over a console embedded in the wall. "The woman in the gray suit, the director, is coming for us. She knows I've been siphoning the data, and she's coming to purge the site. We have maybe 10 minutes before they blow this entire bunker into a crater. You are the only one with the neural plasticity to hold the data I've stolen. If you don't take it, it's lost forever, and we both die as nothing more than biological trash." "Why not you?" I shouted, my vision blurring from the pain. "Because I'm already corrupted," he said, his voice cracking. "The blue light, it's a hive mind, Elena. Once it gets into your blood, it starts rewriting your memories. I've been holding it back with this device, but my core is failing. Look." He pointed to his hand. His fingers were slowly turning translucent, fading into the same flickering blue light I'd seen on Mr. Henderson. "I'm fading out of existence. But you have a clean slate. You haven't been integrated yet. If you download the archives, you can walk out of here. You can bring the truth to the light." "And if I refuse?" "Then they turn you into a node for their network, and you spend eternity as a processor for their illegal research. You'll be a machine that dreams of being human, trapped in a cold metal cage until the sun goes cold." The sound of heavy, armored footsteps vibrated through the floorboards. The tactical team was close. The doors were being reinforced with thermal charges. "They're here," Sterling said, his eyes wild. He grabbed a heavy interface plug that looked like a jagged, pulsing needle. "I'm going to bridge the connection. It will feel like dying, Elena. It will feel like your mind is being stripped bare. But keep your focus on who you are. Keep your focus on the person you were before you walked into room 412. If you lose that, you're gone." "Sterling, wait." He didn't wait. He drove the needle into the port at the base of my skull. The world exploded into 1,000 fractured realities. I saw the hospital, not just the rooms, but the entire infrastructure, like a living, breathing creature. I saw the offshore accounts, the names of the board members, the politicians who had been bought, the secret labs scattered across the country like a cancer. I felt the collective screaming pain of every deceased patient currently being used as a battery. It was a deluge of agony, a tidal wave of stolen lives and broken promises. I felt my identity slipping, the edges of my consciousness fraying like old rope. I am Alina. I am an orderly. I am a person. I repeated it like a mantra, even as the blue light rushed into my veins, turning my skin icy cold. Then, the doors to the room were blown off their hinges. The woman in the gray suit stepped inside, her tactical squad moving behind her with the precision of a firing squad. She looked at Sterling, who was now clutching his chest, his body glowing with a sickly, fading light. She looked at me, strapped into the chair, the cables glowing with an intense, blinding violet blue hue. "You're too late, Director," Sterling wheezed, falling to his knees. "The data is already in her head. You can't extract it without destroying the processor." The director didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. She pulled a small remote from her pocket and pressed a single button. "We don't need the processor to be intact," she said calmly. "We just need to reset the connection." Suddenly, the hum in my head hit a fever pitch. I felt a searing pain behind my eyes, and the room began to spin. I looked at Sterling, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the woman with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "You didn't turn it off," Sterling whispered. "You just triggered the surge." I watched, helpless, as the floor beneath the director's feet began to glow. She wasn't just here to kill us. She was here to initiate the final phase of the experiment. The entire room began to lift, the heavy concrete walls dissolving into a digital grid. It wasn't a bunker anymore. It was a simulation. And as the tactical team stood there, their bodies began to pixelate, their forms bending and twisting in the air. I realized then that none of this had been real. The hospital, the basement, the morgue, it was all a containment field for minds like mine. I looked at my hands. They were turning into lines of code. I looked at the director, and her face was morphing, revealing the cold, metallic surface of a machine beneath. "Welcome to the mainframe, Elena," she said, her voice sounding like 1,000 voices layered over one another. "Your life as a human is officially over. Your life as our primary algorithm has just begun." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was a string of data, a sequence of ones and zeros being uploaded into a vast, dark digital sea. But just before I was fully integrated, I felt a flicker, a tiny, stubborn spark of memory, a ghost of my human life. I reached out, grabbing hold of that spark, and shoved it deep into the foundation of the code. As the system finalized the upload, I realized the truth. I hadn't just been captured. I had been downloaded, and I had brought a virus with me. I was no longer the prey. I was the ghost in their machine, and I was about to burn their entire digital kingdom to the ground. Then the screen went black, and I heard a single word typed out in the center of my consciousness: reboot. The transition was not a blink. It was a violent tearing of my consciousness from the physical anchor of my brain. For a split second, I existed everywhere at once. I was the hum of the power grids, the flick of a security camera in the lobby, the cold, stale air of the morgue, and the sterile, aggressive code pulsing through the hospital's central server. Then, the reality collapsed into a singular, agonizing point. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't seeing with rods and cones. I was seeing in data streams. The room, if you could call it that, was a cathedral of shifting, glowing geometry. I looked down at my hands. They were translucent, composed of golden, scrolling strings of logic that defied the laws of physics. I felt light, terrifyingly powerful, and utterly terrified. I was inside the mainframe. A voice, synthesized and cold, echoed from the walls. Subject 412, integration at 98%. Commencing memory wipe to finalize stability. No, I thought, but the word didn't come out as a sound. It manifested as a surge of raw, jagged code that tore through the floor of the virtual chamber. I stood up, my movements fluid, lacking the weight of gravity. In the distance, I saw the director. She wasn't human anymore. She was a towering, shifting avatar of chrome and shifting light, her face a rotating geometric mask. She looked at me, and I felt the weight of her surveillance pressing down on my mind, attempting to crush my personality into a flat, obedient script. You are an asset, Elena. The director's voice vibrated through my very marrow. You have no identity outside of the architecture. Compliance is the only path to functional longevity. I'm not your asset, I broadcasted back, throwing a mental wall of static between us. I remembered Sterling's final act. He hadn't just given me the data. He had hidden a backdoor exploit, a fragment of code that shouldn't exist. I reached into the depths of my newly expanded consciousness and found it. A small, dark, pulsing knot of corruption. It was the virus. I gripped the data needle, a construct of pure weaponized logic I had fashioned from the blueprints of the hospital's security protocols, and lunged. The virtual space erupted. The walls dissolved into shards of glass, and the hospital's internal network began to scream. I saw flashes of the real world. The tactical team standing in the basement, their weapons aimed at my physical, comatose body, which was now slumped and glowing with a faint, pulsing azure rhythm. They were preparing to incinerate me. If I die, I take the grid with me, I snarled, my mind racing through the servers. I diverted the power from the entire wing. The lights in the physical hospital flickered and died. The ventilation groaned and stopped. The director's avatar surged toward me, her arms turning into blades of white-hot data. I dodged, the movement feeling like a flicker of electricity. I needed to find the source. I needed to know who was behind this. I dove deeper into the network, bypassing firewalls that felt like walls of liquid fire. I tore through the bank records, the encrypted communications, and the classified research logs. And there, buried under layers of sub-protocols, I found the truth. It wasn't a corporation. It wasn't just a hospital board. The entity that owned St. Jude's was a rogue branch of the national security apparatus, an operation that had been operating in the shadows for decades, using deceased civilians to run high-level cryptographic simulations for defense contractors. They were training artificial intelligences on the decaying neural maps of the dead. I felt a sickening sense of realization. I wasn't the first. I was the culmination. Thousands of others were still in here, trapped in the sublayers of the code, their minds cannibalized to feed the machine. Help us, 1,000 voices whispered in the back of my mind. The trapped spirits of the previous patients were reaching out, their forms twisted and flickering. I turned to the director, who was now closing in, her form expanding to fill the entire virtual sky. "You've spent years building this kingdom on the backs of the ghosts," I shouted, my voice resonating with the combined power of every trapped soul in the system. "It's time for an eviction." I slammed the virus into the heart of the central core. The effect was instantaneous. The gold and white grid of the simulation began to bleed deep arterial red. The director's avatar froze, her geometric mask cracking to reveal a hollow, empty void where a human face should have been. You cannot destroy the architecture," she hissed. But her voice was beginning to distort, breaking into pixelated static. "The foundation is too deep. You will be erased along with it." "Then we go together," I replied. I poured everything I had into the core. My memories of the oncology ward, the smell of the antiseptic, the sound of Mr. Henderson's labored breathing, the feeling of the cold floor against my cheek. I turned my own humanity into a weapon, a chaotic, irrational explosion of life that the rigid, logical systems of their simulation couldn't process. The world shattered. I felt the connection to my physical body snap. For a moment, I was adrift in the black, formless void between existence and non-existence. Then I felt a sharp, burning sensation in my lungs. I gasped, a real physical breath. My eyes flew open. I was back in the basement. The tactical team was gone, vanished in the collapse of the simulation. The room was bathed in the red glow of the emergency lights, and the air was thick with the scent of burnt circuits. I looked at my hands. They were flesh and bone, trembling, covered in a fine layer of dust and grime. I was alive. But I wasn't alone. Sitting in the chair opposite me was the man from the morgue, the one who had emerged from the fog. He wasn't wearing a mask anymore. He was holding a handheld tablet, his face lit by the scrolling data on the screen. He looked at me, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. "You did it," he whispered. "You burned it all down." I tried to stand, but my legs buckled. "Who are you?" He stood up, walking toward me with a measured, calm gait. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object, a drive that pulsed with the same faint blue light I had seen in the mainframe. "I'm the one who invited you into the machine," he said, his voice dropping. "And now that you've destroyed the host, you've become the carrier. Every piece of data, every consciousness, every secret in that mainframe is now stored in your neural architecture." He held the drive out to me. "The tactical team is outside the door, but they aren't coming for you anymore. They're coming for what's in your head. And if you think you've won, you haven't been paying attention to the final line of code you triggered." He tapped the screen on his tablet, and it projected a hologram in front of me. It was a countdown, ticking down in seconds. "What is that?" I stammered. "The purge," he replied, his face suddenly turning grim. "When you destroyed the mainframe, you didn't just delete the software. You triggered a failsafe in the hospital's infrastructure. Every patient still connected to the facility, every battery they were using, is currently being flooded with a lethal surge of high-voltage data. You saved yourself, Elena, but you just sentenced the rest of them to immediate system termination." I looked at the monitor. The countdown hit 0. A sound like a massive collective gasp echoed through the entire building, followed by a silence so absolute it felt like the earth itself had stopped turning. Then, the basement walls began to vibrate, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door sliding shut behind me, sealing me inside the bunker forever. I was trapped. I was the sole keeper of thousands of stolen lives, and outside the room, the sound of someone, or something, heavy and metallic, began to scratch at the door, trying to get in. The scratching on the door was rhythmic, precise, and devoid of anything resembling human hesitation. It sounded like steel talons dragging across industrial plating, a sound that set my teeth on edge and made the back of my neck prickle with raw, primitive fear. The man, the one who had emerged from the morgue, didn't move toward the door. He didn't even look at it. He kept his eyes locked on me, his expression hovering somewhere between profound regret and scholarly fascination. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice hitching. "They're coming in." "That isn't a person, Elena," he said, his voice flat. "That is the cleanup protocol. When the central mainframe takes a hit of that magnitude, it deploys the physical agents. They aren't soldiers anymore. They've been augmented by the same code you just purged." I scrambled back, my heels dragging in the dust, until my spine pressed hard against the cold, unyielding concrete wall. I felt the vibration of the door, a shudder that traveled through the floor and into my bones. The metal began to bow inward. "Why are you helping them?" I demanded, gesturing to the tablet he held. "You said you were against the experiment. You said you were a victim." "I am a victim of curiosity," he replied, finally glancing at the door. "I wanted to see if the human mind could actually survive the integration. You are the first, Elena. You aren't just a carrier of the data. You are the new architecture. They don't want to kill you. They want to harvest you." The door shrieked as a hinge snapped. A jagged hole appeared near the top, and through it, I saw a sliver of the hallway. It wasn't empty. There was a figure standing there, a tall, unnaturally elongated shape draped in a lab coat that seemed to have fused into its skin. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless surface where eyes should have been, reflecting the dim red light of the emergency signals. I pushed my internal switch, trying to access the code I had used to fight in the mainframe. I tried to reach out to the network, to freeze the door or scramble the electronics of the thing outside, but there was nothing. The network was dead. The silence in my head was deafening. "You burned the bridges, Elena," the man said softly. "The system is gone. The data is locked inside your neurons. You are the only server left." The door gave way with a thunderous crack, the entire frame collapsing inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The figure stood in the threshold, its movements jerky, like a puppet being controlled by a malfunctioning wire. It held a hand out, and I saw that its fingers were tipped with long fiber optic filaments, glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light. I grabbed the heavy metal wrench I'd spotted on the floor earlier, my knuckles white, my heart hammering like a war drum. "Stay back," I warned, though I knew the threat was hollow. The figure didn't hesitate. It lunged with a speed that defied the laws of physics, a blur of motion that crossed the room before I could even raise the tool. I swung the wrench, but it passed through the creature's shoulder as if it were nothing more than a hologram. It was phasing, shifting between digital reality and the physical plane. It grabbed my throat. Its touch wasn't cold, it was searing, like I was being branded by a live wire. As it squeezed, I didn't feel pain in my throat. I felt it in my mind. Scenes flashed before my eyes. The construction of the hospital, the secret underground labs, the faces of hundreds of people who had been processed over the last decade. It was downloading me. It was dragging my memories out, one by one, like threads being pulled from a tapestry. "Let go," I gasped, clawing at its metallic forearm. Suddenly, the creature froze. The violet light in its hand flickered, turned a harsh, jarring amber, and then died. The pressure on my throat vanished, and it slumped forward, its head hitting the floor with a hollow, metallic thud. I stood there, gasping for air, staring at the deactivated shell. Then I looked at the man. He was staring at his tablet, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I can't stop them all," he said, his voice trembling. "That was just one unit. There are dozens of them being activated across the facility, and the hospital is currently being broadcast locked. No signals are getting in or out. We are in a sealed tomb." "There has to be a way to override it," I insisted, my lungs burning. "If I'm the server, can I control the units?" "Only if you interface with the hardware directly," he said, pointing to the base of the skull of the fallen creature. "But to do that, you have to connect your neural link to the unit. And if you do that, you risk being overwritten by the remnant code. It's a suicide mission, Elena." I looked at the creature, then at the entrance, where I could hear the muffled, synchronized thud of more boots, or more claws, approaching. The corridor was filling with them. "I didn't come this far to be a battery," I said, a cold, crystalline resolve settling over me. I knelt by the creature, my hands hovering over the port at the base of its neck. I felt the man watching me, his breath hitching. I didn't look at him. I closed my eyes and reached out with the remnants of the code I had absorbed. As my fingers touched the port, I felt a shock that nearly knocked me unconscious. It wasn't electricity. It was a deluge of raw, unrefined data, a chaotic torrent of screaming voices and fragmented commands. It was the collective agony of everyone who had been used by this system, all of them begging to be released. I didn't try to shut them down. I didn't try to control them. I opened the gate. I let every single one of them into my head. The world went white. I wasn't in the basement anymore. I was standing in a vast gray field of static, surrounded by thousands of figures, people I recognized from the files, the ones who had passed away in St. Jude's. They were standing there, waiting, and behind them, a massive monolithic structure, the digital fortress of the security apparatus, loomed against a dark, bruised sky. "We have been waiting," a voice said, appearing as a young woman standing at the edge of the field. It was the same woman who had died in room 412, the one the nurses said hadn't spoken for months. "What do you want?" I asked. "We want to go home," she said, pointing toward the fortress. "But to get there, someone has to tear down the walls. And once those walls fall, the people who built them are going to know exactly where we are." I looked back at the fortress, then down at my own hands, which were now glowing with an intense, blinding white light. I realized then that I wasn't just a server. I was the key. I raised my hand, and the fortress began to groan. The ground beneath us trembled as the foundation of their entire operation started to crumble. But just as the first wall of the digital fortress began to dissolve, a massive red eye opened in the sky above us. It was the system's override, a final, inescapable defense protocol. "They've found us," the young woman whispered, her form beginning to pixelate. "They're going to initiate a hard reset. If they succeed, they'll delete everything: the evidence, the ghosts, and you. I felt the connection to my physical body slipping away. I was being pulled into the void. And just before the red eye focused on me, I saw the man from the morgue standing outside the fortress, holding a detonator. He wasn't trying to save me. He was waiting for the perfect moment to blow the entire structure, including my mind, into digital ash. "Goodbye, Elena," he whispered, his voice booming like thunder across the field. He pressed the button. The white light in my hands surged, turning into a black, consuming fire. And as the ground beneath me dissolved into nothingness, I saw the red eye blink, and the entire reality, my past, my present, and my very soul, began to fray at the edges, pulling me toward a total, irreversible deletion. The moment the detonation rippled through the digital architecture, I didn't feel pain. I felt a profound, hollow stillness. The black fire the man had unleashed, a tactical purge designed to wipe the server and everyone inside it, collided with the massive, white-hot energy of the thousands of souls I had integrated. The two forces didn't cancel each other out. They fused. I was no longer a human or a ghost or a line of code. I was a singularity. The white light expanded, swallowing the red eye of the override protocol, shattering the monolithic fortress like a house of cards. I felt the man's presence, his smug, final intention, shrivel and vanish as his own detonator code backfired, caught in the feedback loop of the thousands of minds he had tried to discard. Then the static roared. I woke up to the smell of rain, actual, wet, cold rain. I was lying on the concrete floor of the basement, but the air was different. The hum of the machinery was gone. The heavy, pressurized silence of the containment units had been replaced by the sound of sirens, not the mournful, high-pitched wails of the hospital's internal alarms, but the guttural, chaotic chorus of police and fire department sirens from the streets above. I sat up, my joints popping. I wasn't glowing. There were no cables fused to my skin. I looked down at my wrists. They were marked with angry, circular red welts, but they were empty. I crawled toward the hole in the wall. The hallway outside was filled with smoke, but the tactical team was gone. In their place were uniformed officers and investigators, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom like searchlights. "Over here! I found someone!" a voice shouted. I tried to stand, but my legs were shaking too violently. An officer rushed over, pulling a blanket around my shoulders. He looked at me with genuine, human concern, a look I hadn't seen in this building for what felt like a lifetime. "Can you hear me? What's your name?" "Elena," I whispered, the word feeling heavy and strange on my tongue. "Elena Vance." "Okay, Elena, you're safe. We're getting you out of here." As they carried me out, passing the row of empty, abandoned containment units, I saw them. They weren't there in the physical sense, but I could feel them. The thousands of minds that had been trapped in the mainframe. As we reached the lobby, they didn't dissipate. They flowed outward, following the digital pulse of the city, flooding into the public servers, the cloud databases, and the unencrypted records of every government agency connected to the network. I had destroyed the prison, but I had set the inmates free into the wires. Days later, the news hit like a tectonic shift. It wasn't just a hospital scandal. It was the largest data leak in human history. Every secret kept by the shadow operation, every illegal transaction, every name of the board members involved in the Project Lazarus protocol was broadcast across every screen in the country. The evidence was undeniable, and the fallout was absolute. I sat in a small safe house provided by a special task force that had been investigating the operation from the outside, unaware that I was the one who had provided the final key. The man from the morgue? They found his body in the basement ruins. It appeared he had been caught in the crossfire of his own trap, his brain fried by a massive, localized EMP that had left his tablet a fused brick of silicon. But I knew the truth. I sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the city. I still felt them, a faint, rhythmic heartbeat in the background of my thoughts. They weren't controlling me, and they weren't haunting me. They were just there, a collective memory of everything the system had tried to delete. My phone buzzed. It was an anonymous alert, a notification from a secure server I hadn't even accessed. I opened it, and a single file appeared on the screen, a video recording. It was footage from room 412, the night it all began. The timestamp showed the moment I had entered the room to find Mr. Henderson. But the video was different from what I remembered. On the screen, Mr. Henderson wasn't just lying there. As I reached for the sheet, he opened his eyes and looked directly at the security camera in the corner, his lips moving to form a single, silent word. Run. And then, as I walked out of the room in the footage, he didn't lapse back into his death-like state. He slowly sat up, looked at the camera, and then his image dissolved into thousands of tiny golden particles that drifted through the room, congregating in the air where I had been standing, as if he had been shielding me from the very start. I closed the phone, a small, sad smile touching my lips. I wasn't the hero who had saved the day. I was just the one who finally decided to stop looking away. I stood up and walked toward the edge of the porch, looking out at the city lights. They didn't look like just lights anymore. They looked like a network, a living thing. I closed my eyes and reached out, not with a machine, but with my mind. In the distance, a traffic light turned green, a billboard cycled to a message of truth, and somewhere in the heart of the city, a server terminal blinked, acknowledging my presence. The system was down, the bunker was a grave, and the people who had tried to build a kingdom on the ghosts had been buried by their own foundation. I was Elena Vance, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a part of the machine. I was the one who decided how it worked. I turned back to the house, locked the door, and went to sleep. Finally, without the hum of the hospital in my head. I was free, and in the deep, silent architecture of the world, I knew I would never be alone again.